This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 398, part 2, entitled Masculisting Male Feminists with Feminist Girlfriends. Carrying straight on. Young women will be strongly influenced by growing talk of biconscious masculist walkouts on a massive scale. They will learn that if they don't become biconscious themselves, then they will risk having a biconscious masculist walk out on them, and that will scare the shit out of them, since a young woman has two major functions in her young life. One is to find a manslave to work for her, to help pay for her to have her kids. The other is to grow and raise those kids. She knows that being a committed female careerist and raising very small kids at the same time is practically impossible. So she really wants to find some manslave who is prepared to work for her, so she knows she has to adapt to the expectations of most men. Otherwise, she risks being left to rot on the shelf, and worse, being spat at for being a hated manslaving parasite, a fluffy manslaver whom men increasingly, especially masculistic men, have a real hatred for. So she adapts. Through fear, she bothers to learn what this masculism is all about, since she has been told by women's magazines, the media, and particularly by her female friends, that a woman who gets the reputation of being a fluffy in her social circle faces the kiss of death in terms of getting a man, since most men in the coming few years will have been infected by the masculist virus and will not look twice at a hated fluffy manslaving parasite. They will only spit at her, reviling her as a pariah to be wiped off the face of the earth by being totally ignored by men, not even pumped and dumped. Once millions of men, masculistic men, feel the wind in their sails as the 2020s become the decade of men's lib, then they will beef up their public presence, preaching masculist values on the media, so that the culture as a whole gets caught up with masculist thinking, masculist values, so that masculist ethics become in the air. Once that happens, then the masculists will be in a much stronger position to put moral and political pressure on the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, for example, particularly in the divorce courts, which currently are so massively gender unjust to men that they scream out for reform by, for example, making custody of children joint by default, by throwing out alimony, by expecting women to be FIPs, and if they're not, then society will look down on them as inferior, incompetent parasites who should have fipped up and are punished for not having done so. Fluffies will thus die out as young women stream into the career-competent majors, for example, calculus at high school. That was compulsory for 11th and 12th graders in high schools in the Soviet Union. Then the masculists, combined with female masculists and young women who are desperate to obtain the sperm of quality men, in brackets, whom they desperately want to mate with to obtain the superior DNA of superior men for their kids, close brackets, can combine forces and form a bloc vote in favour of the menfairing of the gender laws. The masculists will be telling these desperate young women that the root cause of their babylessness is the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites who have taken over the divorce courts and made divorce so toxic for men that quality men refuse to marry and have babies. So if these desperate young women want these quality men to give them their sperm, then these young women need to vote with men for the menfairing of the gender laws, for the reform of the divorce courts, for the legislation of the para, so that men are prepared to be fathers again. But that's not going to happen until the gender laws are first menfaired. The masculists will apply strong moral pressure on young women to vote with men, so that the percentage of voters who are in favour of the menfairing of the gender laws goes over 60%. thus forcing the gender politicians to do what the masculists want. Otherwise, they will be voted out of power by the combined voting bloc of men, that is masculistic men, and female masculists, particularly young babyless women who desperately want to be mothers to fulfill their core female raison d'etre. Thus, in light of all the political and social steps above, the millions of failed relationships, in brackets, due to biconscious boyfriends walking away from their monoconscious girlfriends, close brackets, will serve as a valuable first stepping stone to all those later steps. Masculist and MGTOW ideas are now starting to enter the mainstream media, admittedly in a very feminist, female-biased way, since nearly all feminists at the time of writing of this flyer, that's November 2020, are monoconscious, who haven't a clue about masculinist ideas and values, so inevitably are monoconsciously biased. It's the task of masculist theorists like myself to educate such women, but doing so is difficult when the level of monoconsciousness of these women is such that they resist the penetration of masculist ideas to the general public, the millions. But progress is happening. Then once the masculist message reaches the millions, millions of men will be influenced by masculist ideas, who will go MGTOW and reject marriage and paternity, thus panicking young women all the more. So there will probably be millions of such relationships that fail due to monoconscious feminist women being unable to cope and accept the biconscious ideas of their masculistic boyfriends, who then feel disgusted at the monoconscious bigotry of their monoconscious girlfriends and punish them by dumping them, in search of more biconscious women who understand masculism and sympathise more with its values. The biggest fight for the masculists, both male and female, will be for the legislation of the para. Since once the para is legislated, it will force women to grow up, to fip up, and that idea terrifies millions of women who at heart still have fluffy values, who still dream of having their life saved by some white knight manslave. When the para is really pushed for, we will see what women's true expectations of men are. We will see at a deep level that most women have the expectation of men that men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. So if men are given the para, then this core expectation of women of men will be destroyed, thus forcing women to grow up and take financial responsibility for their own lives. Doing this is just part of life to a female fip, but terrifying to a real fluffy who has been brainwashed all her life that some manslave will save her, that some white knight prince will find her glass slipper and marry her so that she lives happily ever after, living off his money, his labour, so that she can sit on her fat parasitic ass and raise her kids in the middle class castle that he pays for. She then knows that if she gets bored with her husband, who is often her 41st penis, according to surveys, in brackets, that is, that the average woman, under the influence of the pill and feminism, has had some 40 different penises in her by the time she's 30, close brackets, then she can take him to the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court and financially crucify him, taking his kids, his house, half his wealth, get child payments and alimony for life. Very nice for her. But if the para comes, all that goes out the window. So of course she will oppose it with all the feminazi strength that she has. The political fight for the para will probably be as contested a battle as was getting the vote for women by the suffragettes, who eventually resorted to terrorist tactics to get what they wanted, which they did eventually get. Similarly, the masculists are prepared to go on a sex war to get the gender laws menfaired. Otherwise, the birth rate will collapse so badly that whole cultures will be wiped out in a mere generation. The fluffy feminist hypocrites in the divorce courts are seen by the masculists as indirect genociders, so have to be stopped. When the Masculists get on the media, they can present this case so that reasonable, reasoning women and men will agree with this reasoning and push together for the menfairing of the gender laws, particularly for the legislation of the para. So it looks as though the price that women will pay for the menfairing of the gender laws, the legislation of the para, etc., is that millions of monoconscious feminists are going to lose their biconscious boyfriends, who will walk out on them, feeling a disgust for the monoconscious hypocrisy of their former monoconscious girlfriends, for their lack of sympathy for men's issues, for their feminazi callousness in the divorce courts, and especially for their tooth and nail opposition of the legislation of the para, the real battle royal that the Masculists have yet to fight. I see this sacrifice that the monoconscious feminist girlfriends will make as probably the major cause of the menfairing of the gender laws. There are other routes less painful for women. For example, that the feminist journalists take up masculism in a really big way, but that is probably quite unrealistic. I think it's much more likely that first there will need to be a lot of pain suffered by millions of monoconscious feminist girlfriends whose biconscious boyfriends walk out on them before we see real action on the menfairing of the gender laws. Thus, speaking as a masculist theorist and as a masculist strategist, I take my hat off in gratitude to these millions of monoconscious feminist girlfriends, since it will be their pain that will serve as the bridge to the masculist promised land, to the menfairing of the gender laws, to the legislation of the para, to the fipping of women, to the creation of a FIP society, etc. That is, to all those things that the Masculists want. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 390 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.